When self-proclaimed HOA tyrant Greg Thompson started finding neighbors with fake violations and even set up tire-shredding traps, James Parker had enough. Greg's shady crew had been extorting homeowners for years, until they got caught red-handed, tearing down James's fence in the dead of night. But instead of backing down, James made one move that dismantled their entire scheme. Just wait until you hear how a quiet homeowner took down the biggest fraud in the neighborhood. James Parker wasn't the kind of guy who picked fights. At 52, he was past the age of pointless drama. He liked things simple, his lawn trimmed, his bills paid, and his weekends quiet. He wasn't the chatty neighbor type, didn't gossip over fences, and certainly didn't give a damn about whose house had the best seasonal decorations. As far as he was concerned, as long as you weren't throwing beer bottles at his mailbox, you could do whatever you pleased. But peace only lasts so long when you're surrounded by people who think they run the place. For over a decade, James had watched a small but obnoxious group of residents slowly morph into a self-appointed HOA mafia, only without any actual legal authority. They called themselves the Neighborhood Council, a title that carried about as much weight as a kid declaring himself king of the playground. They strutted around the cul-de-sac with clipboards, handing out violation notices for anything they didn't personally approve of. Wrong shade of house paint? That's a fine. Mailbox not pre-approved? Another fine. Christmas lights up past New Year's? Oh, buddy, that's 2 fines. It was laughable, right up until they shoved a fake $500 fine in his mailbox for a fence height violation. Now, James wasn't a lawyer, but he wasn't an idiot either. His fence had been there for years, and unless the state of Florida had suddenly decided to rewrite its property codes overnight, he was in the clear. So, instead of crumbling like they expected, he sent a firm but polite letter right back. Dear Neighborhood Council, I appreciate your enthusiasm for community aesthetics, but unless you've been elected by the state of Florida, or the Almighty himself, you have exactly 0 legal authority over my property. Per Florida statute 720.302, I am not part of an HOA, nor am I subject to your fines. Please refrain from further harassment. Best regards, James Parker. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, James walked outside with his usual cup of coffee, ready to grab the newspaper. But the moment he saw his driveway, the mug nearly slipped from his fingers. Right there, directly in front of his house, someone had installed studded speed strips. Not the mild kind that made you slow down in a parking lot. No, these were the nasty ones. The ones designed to shred your tires if you rolled over them the wrong way. For a solid 5 seconds, he just stared, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then his eyes shifted to the sidewalk. Spray-painted in big, uneven letters like some kind of suburban ransom note were the words, "Pay your fine or pay for new tires." James exhaled slowly, his fingers clenching around his coffee mug. Oh, so that's how they wanted to play this? His lips curled into a tight smirk. Fine, let's play. James didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out who was behind this mess. There was only one person in this entire suburban battlefield, with both the free time and the God complex, to pull a stunt this petty. Greg Thompson, a 67-year-old retiree who had spent his golden years not relaxing, not traveling, not enjoying life, but turning the neighborhood into his personal police state. Greg was the self-appointed protector of community values. He didn't just enforce the imaginary HOA rules, he invented them. This was the same man who once threatened to fine a single mom because her kid's bike was left on the lawn for more than 10 minutes, sent anonymous letters to an elderly couple for having a tacky garden gnome, tried to ban Halloween decorations because they supposedly attracted the wrong element. Yes, because 6-year-olds dressed as Spider-Man were a national security threat. And last Christmas, he went house to house with a clipboard measuring holiday lights to make sure no one had an excessive display. In other words, Greg was the kind of guy who wakes up in the morning and chooses villainy. And now, he had escalated from passive-aggressive letters to full-blown sabotage. James stood there, staring at the tire-shredding trap in front of his house, his jaw tightening. He could already hear Greg's smug voice in his head, probably laughing about how he'd finally taught him a lesson. James exhaled slowly. Oh, Greg. He had no idea who he was dealing with. James wasn't the type to throw a tantrum. He wasn't about to storm over to Greg's house, pound on his door, and scream in his face like they were in some reality TV courtroom drama. No, James was the type of man who believed in playing the long game. So instead of taking the bait, he turned around, walked back into his house, and calmly picked up his phone. First, he made a quick call to the city's public works department. Then, he grabbed a cup of coffee, sat on his porch, and waited. A few hours later, a city public works inspector rolled up in an official truck, clipboard in hand. The guy looked tired, like he'd already seen some stupid suburban nonsense that day, and this was just the cherry on top. He stepped out, took one look at the studded strips, and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "This is a major safety violation," the inspector muttered, snapping photos with his phone, "and it's on public property." James raised an eyebrow. "I figured as much." The inspector shook his head. "Who installed these?" James took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. Then he smirked. "Oh, I have a pretty good guess." The inspector didn't even ask for a name. He already knew the type of person who did this. And sure enough, by the next morning, a crew of city workers arrived in a truck with jackhammers. Within an hour, the illegal tire spikes were ripped out and hauled away. And just like clockwork, as if summoned by the HOA gods themselves, Greg Thompson came storming up James's driveway. James had been waiting for this moment. Greg was furious. The man was nearly vibrating with rage, his face red as a fire hydrant, his fists clenched so tight they were practically shaking. He looked like a high school football coach, seconds away from throwing a clipboard. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. James leaned casually against his mailbox. "I mean, yeah," Greg bristled. His whole body tensed up like he wanted to start throwing punches, but also knew his brittle old man bones wouldn't survive it. "This neighborhood has rules," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward James's chest. "You can't just ignore them?" James slowly raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean your made-up HOA rules?" He folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. "The ones with zero legal standing? Yeah, I think I can ignore them just fine." Greg's eye twitched. James could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "You have no idea what you've done," Greg growled. His voice had dropped lower, as if he was trying to sound intimidating. James just took another long, slow sip of his coffee, smirked again. "Enlighten me." Greg jabbed a finger in his direction. "You'll regret this." James tilted his head. "Will I, though?" Greg didn't answer. He just stood there for a moment, seething, before turning on his heel and stomping away. James watched him go, shaking his head. If Greg wanted a war, he was about to get one. At first, James thought it was just his imagination. A minor inconvenience here, an odd frustration there, things that could be chalked up to bad luck. But then, the pattern started emerging. It began with the trash cans. One evening, he rolled them out to the curb as usual, expecting them to be emptied by the sanitation crew the next morning. But when he stepped outside with his coffee at dawn, they were gone, not tipped over, not dragged down the street by some stray dog. Just gone. He walked around, checking with his neighbors. Nobody had seen a thing. Weird. The next day, it got weirder. His sprinklers started acting up. At first, he thought it was just a pressure issue, maybe a clogged valve. But when he crouched down to check them, he realized that the heads had been deliberately twisted to spray water directly onto his driveway. Some were even aimed toward his porch, soaking the wooden steps. That wasn't an accident. James narrowed his eyes. This was deliberate sabotage. And then, the final straw, the thing that proved this wasn't just bad luck, the cars. Every morning, a different vehicle parked directly in front of his driveway, blocking him in. Sometimes it was a white sedan, other times a black pickup truck. Always different, always just close enough that backing out without hitting them was a challenge. Morning, afternoon, evening. Didn't matter the time of day. Whenever James looked outside, there it was. At first, he considered the possibility that it was just random strangers parking there, maybe some visitors from down the street, maybe a coincidence. But on the third day, when he recognized one of the cars as belonging to Greg's golf buddy, he knew exactly what was happening. This was HOA intimidation, Greg Thompson style. James could practically hear him laughing, probably slapping his knee at the sheer brilliance of his petty little harassment campaign. The message was clear. You messed with us. Now we mess with you. Classic Greg. Classic HOA thug behavior. But here's the thing about James. He wasn't the type to break. If anything, this just made him more determined. He wasn't about to run to the police over some missing trash cans and a few bad parking jobs. That wasn't his style. No, he was going to fight back the smart way. James wasn't stupid. He knew Greg and his little HOA enforcers would escalate if they thought they could get away with it. So he did what any rational person would do when dealing with power-hungry suburban warlords. He installed cameras, not the cheap kind you buy on clearance at Walmart. No, James went full military-grade surveillance. High-definition, motion-activated, night vision-enabled security cameras. One facing his driveway, one covering his front yard, one near the sprinklers, and one hidden inside the porch light. If Greg was dumb enough to pull something shady again, James was going to catch every second of it. And oh, did the cameras deliver. On night one, the footage showed nothing but a few raccoons digging through someone else's trash. On night two, James captured some guy in gym shorts letting his dog piss on his mailbox. Annoying, but not exactly a criminal offense. Then came night three, and that's when things got interesting. At 2:13 a.m., motion sensors tripped. The camera switched on, and James, watching from his phone in bed, saw 3 figures sneaking onto his property. One of them, Greg Thompson himself. And he wasn't alone. Greg had brought 2 of his HOA minions, both dressed in dark clothing, moving like they thought this was some kind of Navy SEAL night operation. James sat up, wide awake now, watching the live feed with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. These guys were really that desperate? He zoomed in, and then he saw it. They weren't just snooping. They were doing something. They had gone straight to his fence, and they were pulling up one of his fence posts, not inspecting it, not taking photos for some fake violation report. They were actively ripping it out of the ground. James laughed. It wasn't an angry laugh. No, this was a genuine, entertained, you really just screwed yourself laugh. Oh, Greg. He had no idea what he had just done. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore. This wasn't a nasty letter or a fake fine. This was trespassing. This was vandalism. This was a crime. James rewound the footage, watching again and again. Each time, his grin grew wider. Now, James had options. He could have uploaded the video to social media, exposing Greg and his goons to the entire world, letting the internet rip them apart. He could have printed screenshots and taped them to every single mailbox in the neighborhood with the caption, "Your HOA president, everyone." He could have even sent the footage to the local news station. But no, this situation called for something better, something bigger. So James didn't just call the cops, he called his lawyer, and that's when things got really, really interesting. A week later, Greg Thompson's world came crashing down. James had been waiting for this moment. He knew it was coming. He had played his cards right, gathered all the evidence, and now? It was time for Greg and his little HOA mafia to face the music. The morning started like any other. Birds chirping, lawnmowers humming in the distance. Suburban life moving at its usual, dull pace. Then, a black sedan rolled into the cul-de-sac. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, folders in hand, and walked right up to Greg Thompson's front door. James didn't even have to see Greg's face to know the exact moment he opened the door and read the court summons. He could hear it, a loud, indignant shout, a string of expletives. The slammed door, James smirked. Game over, Greg. What started as a simple case of vandalism and trespassing quickly unraveled into something much bigger. Greg and his hand-picked HOA thugs weren't just breaking fences. They had been running an entire scam operation. The city attorney got involved, and when they did, oh, it got ugly. Turns out, Greg and his fake HOA had been illegally collecting money from residents for years. They sent out fines that weren't real. They threatened homeowners with lawsuits that didn't exist. They bullied elderly couples into paying thousands of dollars for violations that weren't even in the city code. And the best part? The paper trail was all there. Greg had been so obsessed with keeping records, printing out official violation notices, logging payments, keeping track of who owed the HOA, that he had incriminated himself. When the investigators dug through the phony fines, they found a pattern of fraud, extortion, and illegal obstruction of public property. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a criminal case. And Greg? He was screwed. The courtroom was packed. James sat in the back, arms crossed, watching the show. Greg looked nothing like the power-hungry, self-important HOA dictator James had been dealing with for the past year. He looked small, defeated, like a man who had just realized that his entire suburban empire was built on a foundation of quicksand. His cronies sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. They had played tough when they were sending fake fines and harassing people in the dead of night. But now they were a bunch of middle-aged con artists, sitting in front of a very pissed-off judge. The trial wasn't long. The evidence was airtight. The trespassing and vandalism charges were bad enough. But the attempted extortion and fraud, that's what really sealed Greg's fate. When the judge spoke, you could hear a pin drop. You and your so-called HOA council have extorted thousands of dollars from your neighbors under false pretenses. You have obstructed public property. You have committed vandalism and harassment. This ends today. Greg sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, like he couldn't quite process that this was actually happening. Then the sentence was handed down. Every single homeowner who had paid an illegal fine was getting their money back. Greg and his crew had to pay damages. They had to cover all legal fees. And the cherry on top? The court ruled that Greg was legally prohibited from ever trying to enforce HOA rules again. His fake little council dissolved permanently. It was over. When Greg finally walked out of that courthouse, he looked like a broken man. Gone was the smug confidence. Gone was the self-righteous attitude. James stood outside, leaning casually against his truck, sipping his coffee, just watching. Greg saw him. Their eyes met. For a split second, it almost looked like Greg wanted to say something. Maybe an insult, maybe some bitter last words. But he didn't. He just looked away, defeated, humiliated, finished. James took one last sip of coffee, let out a small chuckle, and shook his head. Some people thought they were above the law, but James had just reminded them that no one is untouchable.